This week isn't the kind you go through on autopilot. There's a shift in how things are moving, and it's not subtle. People are acting faster than they should, saying yes to things they haven't fully thought through, stepping into situations they don't actually have control over. And the problem isn't lack of ability, it's overconfidence, that feeling of, I've got this, right before things start going off track. You'll start noticing more situations that could have been avoided, but weren't. Small mistakes turning into bigger ones. Decisions made too quickly, without proper awareness of consequences. And when that starts repeating, it stops being random. One thing that stands out clearly is excess, too much confidence, too many promises, too many decisions being made under pressure. And that's exactly where problems begin. People committing to things they can't sustain, saying yes when they should hesitate, taking risks they haven't fully measured. And the consequences won't always show up immediately. They build. On a broader level, what shows up isn't one major global event. It's repetition. Patterns appearing in different places at the same time. You might see ground movement, fire-related incidents, sudden structural failures, unexpected disruptions. Not necessarily all in one location, but happening across different regions. And that creates a sense of instability. Not because everything is collapsing, but because multiple systems start shifting at once. Weather also plays a role here, but not in a predictable way. This isn't about normal seasonal change. It's about broken patterns, places behaving differently than they used to, areas that were stable becoming unstable, situations that feel off compared to what people expect. And the key detail here is this. Not everything will be accurately predicted because what's unfolding doesn't fully follow previous models anymore. And that's what creates confusion. Unusual headlines, events that seem out of place, but they're not isolated. They repeat. Now shifting to human behavior, tension rises, patience decreases, reactions become faster and less filtered, and that leads to conflict. Situations that would normally be handled calmly escalate quickly. People speaking before thinking, responding instead of understanding. And many will realize later that they overreacted. There's also a strong presence of forced decisions. Situations where avoiding action is no longer possible. Something has to change. Something has to move. And the more someone resists it, the stronger the pressure becomes, until there's no option left but to act. That's where the cuts come in. And not all of them are planned. Some are necessary endings. Distance, walking away from something that no longer fits. It could involve relationships, work, environments, personal situations. And while it may feel uncomfortable at first, it creates space. Another detail that becomes clearer as this unfolds is timing. Things don't just happen. They happen at the worst possible moment. Delays when something is urgent. Problems when stability is needed. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that amplifies everything because it's not just what happens, it's when it happens. You'll also start noticing disruptions in everyday systems. Nothing extreme on its own, but enough to interrupt flow. Services going down, temporarily delays in response interruptions in things people depend on. And when multiple small disruptions happen together, they create pressure. A big part of this week revolves around distraction, not lack of skill, not lack of knowledge, but lack of attention. People doing things automatically, not fully present. And that's where mistakes happen. Across all areas, work, communication, decisions, movement. There's also movement around money, not a total breakdown, but shifts, unexpected changes in direction, quick decisions involving finances. It could be personal, business-related, or tied to larger structures. And again, the risk comes from acting too fast. At the same time, not everyone will notice what's happening, because without one massive event, everything feels disconnected. But if you pay attention, you start seeing repetition. And once you see repetition, you start anticipating. And that changes everything, because anticipation reduces risk. You don't fall into the same patterns. You don't react blindly. You don't take on things you can't sustain. Another strong element here is fatigue, mental fatigue. People feeling drained without fully understanding why, making decisions without energy, reacting instead of thinking, and that leads to more mistakes. At some point, clarity begins to appear, What doesn't work becomes obvious. What no longer fits becomes clear. What needs to change can't be ignored anymore. And while that clarity isn't always comfortable, it's necessary. You may also notice distance forming between people. Less communication, less engagement, more silence. And that's not always rejection. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's adjustment. There's also exposure. Things that were hidden begin to surface. Situations that were overlooked become visible. Mistakes that were covered come out. And this can involve individuals, groups, or systems. Now, not everything in this week carries negative weight. There are two important positive movements. The first comes from technology, an advancement, an announcement, or a shift that improves something previously limited. It doesn't solve everything, but it opens a new direction. The second comes from recovery. Something that was stuck begins to move again. Progress where there was delay, improvement where there was pressure. It might be subtle, but it matters. Overall, this week isn't defined by one event. It's defined by accumulation, multiple things happening at once, shifting the rhythm, creating pressure, and forcing awareness. So the most important thing here isn't predicting every detail. It's recognizing the moment. Because once you understand that things are more sensitive, you adjust. You slow down before deciding. You pay attention to patterns. You avoid unnecessary risk. Now think about this for a second. Have you been noticing more things going wrong lately, even in small ways? Because when that starts happening, it usually means the shift didn't just begin. It's already in motion. And there's something else that starts to become noticeable once this kind of phase is already in motion. It's not just what's happening outside, it's how people start changing without realizing. You'll see hesitation where there used to be certainty, or the opposite, confidence where there shouldn't be any. People second-guessing things that were already clear, and at the same time rushing into situations they don't fully understand. That imbalance creates instability. Another pattern that begins to show up is repetition in personal situations. Not global events this time, personal cycles. The same kind of problem happening again, the same type of person appearing again, the same mistake repeating in a different form. And when that happens, it's no longer random. It's a signal, something that hasn't been resolved yet, showing up again. You might also notice that things that used to work suddenly don't. A strategy that always gave results stops working. A routine that felt stable starts breaking down. A connection that felt strong begins to feel distant. And that shift doesn't always come with an explanation. It just becomes obvious that something has changed. There's also a stronger sense of internal pressure, not necessarily coming from outside, but from within, a feeling that something needs to be adjusted, that something is out of place. And ignoring that feeling only makes it louder. At the same time, people start reacting more to uncertainty, and uncertainty leads to control. Trying to control outcomes, trying to force situations, trying to fix things too quickly. But the more control someone tries to impose during a phase like this, the more resistance they face. And that's where frustration builds, because things don't respond the way they normally would. Effort doesn't always lead to immediate results. And patience becomes necessary, even for people who don't like waiting. Another important detail is how information spreads during this kind of period. Faster, but not always clearer. You may see incomplete information, exaggerated reactions, conclusions drawn too early, and that adds to confusion because people react to what they think is happening, not always to what actually is. There's also a tendency for overexposure. Too much input, too much noise, too many things happening at once, and that overwhelms perception, making it harder to focus on what actually matters. At a deeper level, this phase also brings a kind of reset, but not in a clean, organized way. It's messy. It comes through disruption, through things not working as expected, through situations forcing change. And while it may feel uncomfortable, it serves a purpose. Because what doesn't adapt starts to break down, and what adapts finds a way to move forward. Another subtle but important shift is how people relate to time. Things feel either too fast or too slow. Moments where everything happens at once, followed by periods where nothing seems to move. And that irregular rhythm makes it harder to stay grounded. At this point, awareness becomes the key factor, not control, not prediction, awareness. Because awareness allows you to pause before reacting, Observe before deciding. Recognize patterns before repeating them. And that's what separates someone who moves through this phase clearly from someone who gets pulled into it without realizing. Now think about this. What have you already seen repeating in your life recently? Not once, but more than once. Because that's exactly where this phase is working the most. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And there's a point where everything that felt scattered starts to connect, not all at once, but enough for you to notice that the same type of tension is showing up in different areas. Work starts to feel heavier. Conversations feel shorter, more direct, sometimes colder. Decisions that used to be simple now require more thought. And that's when you realize it's not just a bad day or a random week. It's a phase. Another thing that becomes clearer here is how quickly things can shift. Something that felt stable yesterday doesn't feel the same today. A plan changes, a person changes, a situation reveals a different side, and it doesn't always come with warning. It just happens. You'll also start noticing that some people become more distant, while others become more reactive. Some withdraw completely, others engage too much, too intensely. Both are responses to the same pressure, just expressed differently. There is also a stronger presence of unfinished situations. Things that were left unresolved begin to demand attention again. Old conversations that were never fully closed, decisions that were postponed, situations that were ignored, and now they return. Not because they want to, but because they need to be resolved. At this stage, avoidance becomes harder. What was easy to ignore before now feels unavoidable. And the longer it's pushed aside, the more it builds, until it reaches a point where it can't be delayed anymore. Another detail that becomes important is how people deal with responsibility. Some will step up, others will try to escape it. And that difference becomes very visible. You'll see who follows through and who withdraws when things get complicated. There's also a shift in how trust is perceived, not necessarily broken, but questioned. Situations that felt certain start to feel uncertain, and that leads people to reassess who they rely on, what they believe, what they commit to. At the same time, clarity keeps increasing, not in a comfortable way, but in a direct one. Things become obvious, not because they changed, but because they can no longer be ignored. And this is where real change begins, not from external events, but from internal decisions, choosing differently, acting differently, responding with more awareness. Another subtle shift appears in how people value their time. Less tolerance for what feels unnecessary. Less patience for what drains energy. More attention to what actually matters. And that leads to natural separation from certain situations. There's also a quiet kind of resilience building here. Even if things feel unstable, there's learning happening, adaptation happening, people adjusting in ways they didn't expect. And that's important. Because even in a phase of pressure, there's movement forward. Now take a moment and think about this. What in your life has started to feel different, even if nothing major has happened yet? Because that's exactly how this kind of phase works. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. It shows up in details, in patterns, in shifts that are small at first, but impossible to ignore once you see them. And then there's a moment where everything slows down just enough for you to actually see what's been happening. Not because things stop, but because your perception catches up. You start connecting things that didn't make sense before. That conversation, that decision, that reaction, they weren't isolated. They were part of the same movement. And this is where awareness turns into choice. Because once you see the pattern, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. You either adjust or you repeat. Another thing that becomes very clear here is that not everything needs to be fixed immediately. There's a tendency during phases like this to want to resolve everything at once, to close every loop, to force answers, but that doesn't always work. Some things need to unfold, some things need time, and pushing too hard can create more resistance. There's also a shift in how people deal with silence. Silence stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming necessary. Less noise, less explanation, less reaction, and more observation. At this point, what matters most is not speed, it's precision. Not how fast you decide, but how clearly you see. Not how much you do, but what you choose to do. Because during a phase like this, it's easy to get pulled into everything. Every conversation, every situation, every reaction, but not everything deserves your energy. And that becomes obvious if you pay attention. Another important detail is how cycles begin to close. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable one. You simply know something is over. Even if nothing official was said, even if there was no clear ending, you feel it. And when that happens, holding on only creates more pressure. Letting go creates space, and that space is necessary for what comes next. There's also a stronger sense of internal alignment starting to form. Even if everything around feels unstable, inside, things begin to organize. You start understanding what fits and what doesn't, what stays and what needs to go. And this is where the shift becomes real. Not because the world changed, but because your perception did. So by the end of this phase, the most important question isn't what happened. It's what did you understand from it? Because once you understand, you don't go back to the same patterns. You don't make the same decisions. You don't react the same way. And that's where real change happens. Not in the event itself, but in what it reveals. Now think about this, honestly. What have you been seeing clearly that you were ignoring before? Because that's exactly where this entire movement has been pointing from the beginning.